For the next session, we have a reporters panel. I've asked for outstanding journalists to come talk about coverage of criminal justice issues from different angles. First up, we're going to have Libor Jany, who is a reporter for the public safety team at the Minneapolis Star Tribune. He got a start in journalism at the St. Paul Pioneer Press across the river. He attended Lewis and Clark College and Mississippi State University. He has been one of the pivotal reporters on the George Floyd story since last May. The Minneapolis Star Tribune, with him in the lead, won the Pulitzer Prize for its coverage of George Floyd, won the Polk Award for the same story, and he was named the NABJ's Journalist of the Year just a couple of weeks ago, so congratulations on all of that. And I've asked him to basically talk about the coverage of George Floyd, how it evolved, what the hurdles were that he faced, and kind of how he and his team covered the story last year, and kind of how they've been covering it since then and through the trial and so forth. Then we have with us Weihua Lee, who is a data reporter at the Marshall Project, the news organization I'm sure you're all familiar with that focuses on criminal justice. She studied journalism and comparative politics at Boston University and graduated from Columbia with a master's degree in data journalism. That's what she's going to be talking about, data journalism when it comes to criminal justice, how you can, what data you can trust, what data you should be a little bit suspicious of, kind of where you can find good data sources. Annie Sweeney is on the criminal justice team at the Chicago Tribune, where she's been covering criminal justice for a couple of decades. She's going to talk about the consent decree for the Chicago Police Department. She's going to talk about some of the stories she's covered over the years, including some of the more interesting stories that she's done. It was one story tracing the path of one gun that was stolen in Superior, Wisconsin, brought to Chicago, where it was used in dozens of shootings. So she previously worked at the Sun-Times and is a graduate of the University of Missouri-Columbia and Trinity College in Dublin. And I was pleased this morning to wake up and see that one of my speakers was leading the Chicago Tribune this morning. So the triple byline on this story is led by Annie. What's happened with this case today?
They rested about 40 minutes ago. They're done with, the head of our police union is facing firing, and he testified today. So they are done for the day, but 2 more days.
Okay, so actually when I saw her leading the paper this morning, my first reaction was panic, because I thought, oh crap, am I going to lose a speaker, because she gets called into breaking news, but she has backup, so thank you for handling that. And then finally we have with us Ted Guest, who you met a couple nights ago, but he is president of Criminal Justice Journalists and Washington Bureau Chief of the crimereport.org. He is a longtime reporter, a longtime expert on criminal justice reporting. He did that a long time for his hometown newspaper, the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. He continued at the U.S. News and World Report in Washington. There he also covered the White House, the Supreme Court, and law schools. And he is going to talk about 2 things. He's going to talk about crime statistics and how you can make sense of them. And then he's going to talk a little bit about how to make the most out of covering the ASC conference, which you all will be going to starting on Wednesday. So we are I'm just going to ask each of them to talk for 10 or so minutes about a specific aspect of the beat, the things that I've just been, kind of the topics I've been addressing here. A couple of them have slide decks, a couple of them just have links to show. We'll generally go through all 4 of them and then have a good amount of time for Q&A. If you have a kind of a question, a clarifying question that you want to get addressed, raise your hand. We'll make this as informal as possible, but I do want to make sure we hear from all 4, and then we have plenty of time for questions asked after. So we'll go to Libor first.
So again, my name is Libor Jany. I'm a public safety reporter for the Minneapolis Star Tribune. I've been on the job, I say, about 8 or so years, covering cops and courts for about 6.5 of those years. Just a little bit of background on how we kind of stumbled across the George Floyd's case or murder of George Floyd. I had just wrapped up a holiday shift, and I was heading home when I got a rather sort of cryptic text message from the PIO from the local police department telling me about a news conference. The only thing that he told me was that there had been an in-custody death and that it wasn't a shooting. Didn't provide any other details aside from that. So I rolled up to City Hall around 10 o'clock or so. You know, these press briefings, I don't know what your experience has been like, but we rarely get anything out of it, or out of them rather. So no mention of a need, no mention of any sort of struggle or the underlying circumstances of the call, just the fact that, again, this guy had died. Around the same time, there started seeing some rumblings on social media about a video that seemed to like directly contradict this initial police account. So my first thought was, even though it was late, I was going to swing by the scene and just to see if I could, you know, scare up some witnesses. But by then, you know, it was hours and hours later. There were just a handful of like investigators and crime scene techs, like kind of milling around, knowing that I could really talk to. But at some point, someone DM'd me a link to the video, and you know, obviously that changed everything from that point on. You see the video, you see it directly contradicts what police said happened. So I started reporting. I went back to the newsroom around 3:30 in the morning. I don't know what the case is in your newsrooms, but at the Strib, even though we still have a healthy-sized newsroom, we don't have an overnight reporter or overnight editor, so no one to post the story until the first person comes in at like 5:30 or so. So I had this story written for, you know, a couple hours. By then we got a follow-up news release saying that the feds were involved, the FBI was looking into this case. So at that point, you know, it tells you that this is serious. But you know, even then, even in the ensuing days, you don't really get you can't really grasp like the enormity of the moment, because to that point it had been an act of police violence or in custody death, something which, you know, I've on this beat have covered a number of times over the years. But you know, and then the city started burning, and as a newsroom, you know, we have the luxury. I've worked in smaller newsrooms where, as one of a handful of reporters, you're kind of tasked with covering everything. But at the Strib, we had the luxury of throwing, you know, several dozen reporters at this story. So, you know, by the end of May, the newsroom was really kind of split into two teams. One team that was still covering COVID, and the other team that was on George Floyd, sort of reporting duty. I'd say after a few days, you know, even though there was still a lot of public interest in finding out what was going on with the protests and the demonstrations, after a few days, you know, we kind of made this conscious decision that we have to get away from this like protest porn coverage. So just merely telling reporters which buildings are burning, or, you know, which intersection is getting occupied, and like trying to take a step back and hopefully do some more in-depth reporting. So that's sort of, it was the other piece about the 3rd precinct. That's sort of how this story came about. You know, we could have probably written a story that was more generalized and looking at the department overall, and some of its, you know, some of the heavy-handed and aggressive policing of years past, but we decided to really focus on this particular precinct. And really, in my mind, the fundamental question was answering the question of why did this particular precinct burn down? What provoked that much like anger and grief and trauma that would, you know, prompt people to take to the streets like that and you know, protest outside of the building, and then eventually lead to burning it down. So, you know, we talked to a number of, myself and my colleague on this story, we talked to a number of like public defenders who'd spent years and years basically going through body cam footage, and you know, almost to a person, they told us, like, yes, we've seen this sort of behavior before. Like, George Floyd wasn't the first person who was kind of handled the same way. So the others, I guess, were fortunate in the sense that, their lives weren't taken. But also ended up talking to, I mentioned the attorneys, talking to a number of community organizers, activists, all of whom could provide some context. And I also talked to a couple of cops, like people that had been on the inside. In fact, the tip for this story came from someone who still worked with the department and who, felt like this particular precinct gave the department a bad rep, like that these cops had always sort of played by their own rules. So we reported it as such. We tried to provide, some context around how this situation came about and the conventional wisdom around like running a precinct or a department is that you want to move your cops around to different precincts or different parts of the city every few years. Because if you don't, and this was the case in the 3rd precinct, it creates this sort of entrenched culture that's kind of above accountability. And so it got to the point where you had a bunch of old timers who in a lot of respects like practiced a very outdated form of policing, which was, again, heavy-handed, I am the law, everything that comes with that. And they ran a couple of supervisors out of the precinct. And yeah, so that was one of the stories that came out of it. I would say, one of the keys to taking on a beat like this is, so strong sourcing, and the payoff, I think, you kind of plant the seeds early on in your career or on the beat. Like you attend countless, nighttime civilian board meetings just to get some face time with, this commissioner or this activist. You go to award ceremonies and graduation ceremonies just to like be seen and by some department officials. And the hope is down the road that they will trust you enough to pick up the phone and call you with this sort of tip or this suggestion that you should look at this particular topic. So I kind of did that for years and years. And then the other thing I would say as far as like covering policing, and maybe this applies to every beat, is I found that the reporters that I respect the most, I think are the best at their job, have a certain level of humility and self-awareness to where they recognize what they don't know and they know to like surround themselves with like smart people basically that'll kind of fill in the blanks for them. So I've always tried to do that.
Well, let's go to Huihua, and she has a slide deck, and you can just tell Alyssa, she'll advance it for you.
Sure. Would you want?
Or if you can come up here also, either way it works.
Yeah, you can come up
Sure,
here if you'd like.
sure.
Just make sure you bring the mic. to
The
talk
mic with me.
it. Yeah.
Gotcha.
And you can just hit here.
Next. Gotcha. Hey, that was really difficult to follow, not only because it was fantastic, but also because I talk a lot. So I'm gonna try to keep this under 8 minutes. We'll see. My name is Huihua Li, and I'm a data reporter at the Marshall Project. Basically, what that means is I tell stories with data and try to interview data as my sources. And I'm going to talk about what does it mean to investigate the criminal justice system with data, and not only data, but the ones that are open, that you can tap into when you are on deadline and don't have to wait for a month for FOIA reports.
Okay.
And this is not what I know. This is sort of a summary of what my team have been doing, and here are our teammates. For some reason, Anna's picture isn't rendering through Google Doc, but that's fine. So I think the first thing that we really take advantage of is local data, because criminal justice is very much a local issue. Every city, every municipality has its own police departments, sheriff offices, prisons, jails, courts. And often these agencies would have dashboards or open data portals that you can take advantage of. The good thing about this is local data usually are more up to date. So you can get, NYPD, for example, publishes data every quarter. I think Chicago PD's data is about 1 week behind. So, after the death of George Floyd, we were very interested in how crime rates have changed because of the pandemic and because of protests. And local data really allowed us to look at that. On the national level, there are a number of good sources of data as well. The FBI collects data from about 18,000 police departments and sheriff offices all over the country through its unified crime reporting and national incident-based reporting systems. You don't need to remember their names, just Google FBI crime data, they're gonna pop up for you. And recently, a couple of years ago, FBI put out a data portal that you can sort of use and interact and get data for different cities with relative ease. So that's become a new good source. The Bureau of Justice Statistics also collects a lot of data when it comes to courts and prisons. They collect information on, for example, what kind of training do police departments have? As well as how much money do jurisdictions spend on courts, on prisons, and on policing? The downside, however, is BJS reports, the Bureau of Justice Statistics reports, are usually quite behind. So you can expect a good 2-3 year. Whereas the FBI's data are usually 1 year behind. They release their crime data every October. And of course, there are fantastic news organizations that do their own data gathering. The most famous one, the most trusted one, is probably Washington Post data set on police shooting. There are countless stories of other news organizations taking advantage of that because they are filling the gap of the federal government. My favorite thing to do is to look at data that are not about criminal justice and think about ways that we can do stories about them, because the criminal justice system at the end of the day is part of society. So even though the federal organizations that collects criminal justice system data are somewhat behind, there are a lot of good other sources that we can tap into. This is a story that we did recently, looking at whether police officers are leaving in droves since the beginning of the pandemic and since the protest against police brutality. A lot of police departments, you probably heard from your own as well, saying we're really losing officers. That's why homicides are going down. That's why homicides are going up. We're interested in looking at what does it look like on national level. So we tap into data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, a fantastic resource, not for criminal justice data, but for labor and economics data. And unlike BJS and the FBI, their experts are very willing to talk to the reporters. So that was the upside as well. And we found that police officers, the number of police officers nationally has declined by about 1%. So it's not necessarily officers leaving in droves. And recently, the FBI released detailed data that showed us that what we saw from the Bureau of Labor Statistics data sets reflect what the FBI collects as well, just it was a bit behind. We also took advantage of voting records. My colleague Andrew Caldron did a story that looked at how many people with felony record and have been re-enfranchised actually voted. What we did is we requested data from 4 or 5 states, asking them for a list of people who have been re-enfranchised or should have been re-enfranchised and be eligible to vote. We crossed that with publicly available voting record to see how many of them actually voted. The number is quite disappointing. I think that what they found is less than 1 in 5 people who were re-enfranchised actually did. They did something quite cool for this story, where since they have the voting record and contact information, they were able to send text message to a lot of them. The initial idea was to do a survey and see, if we can do some sort of data collection. But we soon realized is one, it's quite scary for someone, to reach out to you out of the blue and say, oh, did you know that you could have voted? That's something that we realized very quickly. And the other thing is, for the first 100 or so tests that we did, the sources that we reached out to, these people that we reached out to, almost none of them knew that they could have voted. So that was a part of the story as well. And we released our data methodology so that other reporters in other newsrooms could replicate our analysis and really drill down in their own communities. This is another story that we published using census data to look at criminal justice. Census data publishes the number of people who are in adult correctional facility. So using this, we're able to show from the past three census, how has the number of people incarcerated changed in each county. The news hook with this, of course, is with redistricting and with each community trying to figure out, how do I count people in my prisons, in my jails? Do I count them in the location where they're incarcerated, which are usually rural places, or do I count them in places where they came from? In a lot of cases, these are urban cities. So it's a huge shift of political power. And we, after we did the story, we made the data published, or made this data publicly available for download as well as for browsing. With the hope that local reporters and other people can take advantage of what we cleaned up and brainstorm better stories for themselves. This is another thing that we took advantage of is CDC's data. CDC keeps tab of injuries nationwide. It keeps tab of how many people are sent to emergency rooms each year, and they break it down by cause of injury, demographic information, as well as intent, whether it was assault, whether it was suicide, or whether it was caused during a legal intervention, which majority of that are police use of force incidents. So with that data, we published a story on how thousands of people are being sent to ER each year because of their interaction with the police. And this is just something that a normal, we wouldn't be able to expect from the FBI or from the BJS, unfortunately. This is my favorite part, and I'm going to spend the remaining 1 minute talking about it. Every data set is its own unique snowflake, and it's never perfect. I think data inherently came with some sort of authority. If it's in numbers, if it's in charts, then it has to be right. But it's flawed in many different ways. The questions we usually ask ourselves when we are interacting, when we got a new data set are who collects this information? Why are they collecting it? How far away is what is data presenting us from the universal truth? For example, we know that homicide have been going up. The FBI, when they track homicide, the data program that they use are reported to them voluntarily, which means the police departments can choose how many monthly report data. The police department can choose whether they participate in the data collection at all. So, the real number of homicides is always going to fall short from what the CDC tracks in its vital record. Another example would be when we're talking about crime. A lot of times we're talking about index crimes. We're talking about a group of 7 crimes that experts back in the 70s and in the 60s deems to be important to track, like homicide. What it doesn't track are cyber crimes, for example. What it doesn't track as well are domestic violence issues. And those ones are missing from the quote-unquote official data. And I think it's very exciting as reporters because we have the opportunities to fill in the gap.
So Annie, while we're getting set up here, one thing I forgot to mention about Annie is she was actually a fellow at our last criminal justice program in November of 2019. So we were glad she was playing it forward. So after this program, not me, but somebody from MPF will probably be calling some of you saying, will you come be on a panel sometime? So we will go to Annie now.
I'm ready. Thanks. Hey, everybody. How are you? Ready to be done, I know, the last panel. So I have worked in Chicago, like he said, for decades, more than 2 decades. I've covered crime and violence here, which is surprising to me when I stop and think about it, but it does give me a pretty good perspective on this problem because I've covered it for so long. And I think Chicago is unfortunately a good place to look at these issues because everything that's happening with violence and reform is really exploding here right now. I don't know what other word to use for it. It's and they're overlapping, intersecting problems. I know you guys all know this from covering it. Like they're so related. So, just I know you probably heard from folks today from Chicago about our problem here, but I just pulled some numbers for you just so you could get a good sense of it. It is pretty overwhelming. The big worry in Chicago right now is that we're headed to 800 murders. So there's been a lot of conversation about that. I put down the 13,000 member department, which I think is up to date, but I think that's important to think about because that's also like, that's an institution or a system that has to move, and we're talking about a lot of people. So, and of course, yeah, the number of guns. Chicago is often compared to New York and LA, and we take more guns off the street than they do combined some years. That's usually what you'll hear. I don't know if our police go after more guns than they do in LA or New York, but I do know we do have a lot of guns here and a lot of access to them through states that have different gun laws, which is the story that I did. So let me see if I can move this deck to the next one. So our reform movement actually started here before George Floyd. Laquan McDonald's video was released in November of 2015. This is you guys all know who he is shot by a white officer holding a knife with his back turned, and leads to a lot of changes here, including the charging and conviction of the officer, the firing of a superintendent, a DOJ civil rights investigation, which will conclude that the department is in need of massive reform, which is what leads to a consent decree. I think it's important to know that while this is happening, there's also a new effort in Chicago to kind of build this civilian infrastructure of community-based programming. It gets significant help from philanthropy and community groups, and it's all kind of coming together. They're ready to hit the streets. Some are on the streets, and then Laquan McDonald happens, and the department is positioned for reform. And my memory of that time is there was this sense of like, oh, maybe things are lining up here. Like we've got some recognition that the community should play a role in this. We're gonna have a department that's gonna reform, and we'll see what happens. And then what happened was, in 2016, after the Laquan McDonald video came out, we did have a big jump in violence. It goes back down. And then, we have the pandemic and we have the civil unrest, and like the rest of the country, we are now looking at these really difficult numbers. More than 50% increase, probably, in each. So, I feel like as a reporter covering this, it's like I'm standing between like this intense violence surge that we have to understand and this department, and what are they doing, and what are they doing to fix it, and why is all of this violence happening? And that's what I mean about like it all intersects to me, which is good because a lot of my sources are the same. And so any story I'm writing about, to me, they're all reform stories in many ways. If I'm writing about violence, I'm thinking about like, what is the department doing about this? What haven't they been doing for decades? What are they supposed to be doing and going forward under reform? I obviously am here, like you said, on behalf of a lot of people, because there's, I don't know, on any given week, officially I'm on a 4-person team. We have, it's called criminal justice still. I like that you call it public safety, though. I think that's great. We have a federal courthouse reporter, a state house reporter, somebody who is on top of the department daily for what they're doing, and I have this incredible job. I kind of float and look for ideas and kind of your typical Sunday story enterprise about what's going on, some longer term stuff. So where do we, like between all of us, I was brainstorming with them about, as we're covering both reform and violence, and I don't think any of this is gonna be like insider tips for you guys, but we're out in the neighborhoods, of course. Always have been on our team, at least I always have. Whenever something, violence is happening, we're always like showing up there the next day to try to find the people impacted by it. The official court reform docket, or I'm sorry, consent decree is in the federal courthouse, where there's a judge, a monitoring team who is filing reports that are public, and we're always paying attention to. The department also files reports in response, or when their quarterly reports come out, they're gonna try to tell you everything they've done. As far as the violence goes, we're seeing at our federal courthouse, and I don't know if this is happening, a lot more violence charged. It used to be mostly drug trafficking cases with violence attached. It seems to me they're now going after gun violence in Chicago. State courthouse, Megan is involved in all of this because a lot of convictions are getting reversed, so that's a piece of reform. And of course, any criminal police conduct is charged there, as well as violence cases. Chicago Police Department is obvious. City Hall, we have a really aggressive City Hall reporter who I think has been critical in covering reform. And I have a story on that later. So I just asked our team, like, who are we talking to every day? So I'm just to give you an idea of, any week I might be talking with the activists or organizers who are motivated. I'm sure in all of your communities, they are putting out papers and putting out reports, and obviously outreach and victim advocates when it comes to the violence. I try to also remember that there's a whole group of people, just residents, neighbors, who may not be connected to any group but have really strong opinions, and they should. And so we try to remember them. Police officers who are not your official people, the tip, did you say the tip came from inside? Try to stay in touch with the people at the front lines who are not. And then, of course, experts. Lately in my career, I've gotten to know a lot more experts, sociologists, criminologists, who have been really helpful. Because there's so much to this topic, and people have such passionate, strong opinions, and it's important to have people you can step back and go to, I think, for reality checks on. And then what else? I just asked everybody, what would you advise? So, be wary of the agency in charge for sure, because they're going to put out, if you're covering any department that is in the middle of reform, we have one reporter who always goes to the briefings, and she said just be skeptical if they're telling you they're making a lot of progress. The non-police sources also have really specific, I think, and important missions to push change, but same thing. I think you got to really dig down deep with them about where they're getting their information and the data and everything. We have an IG's office in Chicago that puts out reports. I'm sure some communities here might have. These are supposed to be independent assessments of what's going on. They did a whole analysis of our response to the protests here. And the monitor documents for the consent decree, I've found just some hidden things, like there was one about the experience in Chicago with police, including how often have you had police point a gun at you. The results were not surprising to anyone following this issue about who gets a gun pointed at them, but to have an exact report, data, that was another way for me to engage with readers and say, this is why the Chicago Police Department needs to start thinking about things differently. Here's an actual study that will show you that your experience might be one thing, but it's not the same for everybody. Oh yeah, we look at all breaking crime stories now too to see what it says about reform. We've had 2 foot chase fatal shootings in the city in the past year. Foot chase is a big part of the reform document. The department is supposed to rewrite it, and it's, to me, this super fascinating world of contemplating, when do you chase? Should you chase? When should you stop? You know, the LA model about bring in helicopters and, you know, try to bring in backup first is all, for me, becomes part of an interesting story as the department is trying to work out a policy. The suicide of officers, was also a part of reform. There was a section in there dedicated to how the department should take care of the health and wellness of the officers. Policy decisions that they announce, our superintendent announced a new citywide team in response to a lot of the violence last summer, and my partner on the beat did a pretty critical look at that and how it was working and how it stood up to reform. I put FOIA down there. I know I don't have to tell you what that is, but the reason it's there is because I mentioned our City Hall reporter. He is constantly putting in FOIAs for City Hall officials, including the mayor, for their emails and their correspondence. And just last week, and there's a link to it on the slide, they got a resignation letter from somebody in the reform office who was brutally honest about how he thinks it's going. And it was a fantastic story. And when I tell you that we go to these briefings and they try to tell you everything that's going on, and then you get a letter like that from an insider who, you know, to me, it was one of the best stories we've done recently. The clearance rates is another one that is all about reform. We did a series on that in 2018, again, before George Floyd, but when the city was trying to reform, our clearance rates were terrible. And also, like, the other story that is on the list that doesn't seem reform immediately, but it is to me, black officers in the city of Chicago organized recently. It does have a little bit to do with the current FOP leader. And to hear them talk about why they organized and why they felt their voices need to be heard, it's all about changing the department to them. And it's all about changing the relationship with the community, which is like one of the basic goals of reform. So I'll probably stop there.
And if you could just hand the mic down to Ted. So we'll turn to Ted here to get some thoughts on crime stats and thoughts about how to get the most out of the ASC conference.
Good to see everyone. Yeah, I'm going to do 2 different things here very quickly. One of them is on crime statistics. It may sound a little bit different from, did you pronounce your name? Okay. What she said. I mean, she was all excited about a lot of sources on statistics, which I am too, but I'm going to give you some cautionary notes. Some of you may know some of this. A lot of the statistics out there related to crime and criminal justice are either inaccurate, they're incomplete, or they're very old. So we have to put up with all this. This has been a situation for decades, and I'm sorry to report that I don't think it's gotten that better. It's gotten a bit better, which I will outline here. But I'm disturbed, I guess, by the narrative that we all have contributed to, that crime is up. You see all sorts of news stories, all sorts of places right now just sort of saying, oh, crime is up, violence is up. Well, it's up in some places. It clearly is up in Chicago, but I'm urging you to be careful what kind of crime you're talking about. Looking at the statistical reports carefully. What we do know is that homicides went up last year during the pandemic. We know that because a bunch of different sources have reported that, so I'm not disputing that. What we often ignore is that other categories are down. Someone noted that aggravated assaults were up 3%. I think the first 9 months of this year. Well, 3% is not good, but it's not very high. And other crimes like robberies went way down last year, and you can say that's obvious because a lot of people weren't out anywhere to be robbed. The Bureau of Justice Statistics said that violent crime overall was down greatly last year, from 2 million estimated to 1.6 million. Again, lots of people weren't out on the street. So what I'm urging you to do, and our many colleagues out there, is not fall into this trap of saying that all crime is going up, because I don't think it is. It isn't going up nationally. One of the big problems, I'm sure you know, is that reports to the FBI from police departments are all voluntary. A lot of police departments don't even bother to report to the FBI, and so you get these incomplete figures. To make sure we all know this, there's something called the National Crime Victimization Survey, in which the Bureau of Justice Statistics interviews a representative sample of people about whether you were a crime victim last year. They always get much, much higher numbers than the FBI. Of course, these are estimates because they project them to the whole country. But the point is, that's a different way of measuring everything. The problem there is that BJS historically has put those numbers only nationally. I haven't followed this year. It probably will come up at this meeting this week, but they are trying to do more regional and local reports of these estimates. So if you are doing stories about crime numbers, make sure to check these things out. There's a lot more out there that is in this FBI report. And this does have consequences. It just isn't an interesting debate topic, because what we do influences public opinion. When we write erroneously that all crime is going up, the public believes this. And just a recent Gallup survey, which some of you may have seen, said that 74% of the public thinks that crime was up nationally last year, when as I just said, that is debatable. And I'm pretty sure that is based on focusing just on homicides. Of course, homicides are a big topic, but they aren't the only topic. And 51% of people thought crime was up in their particular neighborhoods, which of course could be true in some cases, but is not true in other cases. And there are even more new sources than we heard in our previous conversation. I'm sure she couldn't cover all of them, but a lot of non-government or non-federal government groups have started to compile crime statistics. Now, one of them you're going to hear about tomorrow morning. Professor Richard Rosenfeld is an expert on this and is working for a group called the Council on Criminal Justice, and he has been doing up-to-date estimates, much more up-to-date than the FBI and the National Institute or National Bureau of Justice Statistics has. The problem there are problems with all of these things. We can ask him about this, but he's going to say that these estimates are based on only 29 cities, including a bunch of big cities, but a bunch of big cities have not reported there either. So he is making, I think, professionally sound estimates, but they're estimates based on a pretty small number of cities. So again, he will cover this tomorrow, and I urge you to pay attention to that. But what we do has can have big consequences on public opinion and in turn on public policy. So I think that's enough on statistics. Now I'm going to discuss the American Society of Criminology meeting, which we're about to attend. Again, there's good news and bad news here. The good news is this is the biggest group of criminologists in the country. So there's going to be a lot of people there, and a lot of sources and a lot of papers. So that's the good news. The other news is, well, first, you're not going to be surprised by this. Their attendance is going to be way down because of COVID. They usually get 3,500 to 4,000 people. The last I saw, they had about 2,000. So it's about half of what it usually is, which is unfortunate. I noted in looking through the program, that a lot of individual programs have been canceled, and probably more will be too. So don't be, this has happened to me already, not this year. It's possible you will see a program and there and say, hey, this sounds pretty interesting, and you go to it and there's no one in the room because it's been canceled. So I'm just urging you or warning you that things are a little bit off this year. Now, the thing you should know about this is that many of you have been to academic conferences. It's not like news conferences. There are going to be hundreds of panel discussions there, and they are not meant as news conferences. So this has been my experience. You're not very likely to get some immediate story out of going to one of these panels. It's possible you will, but probably not. The main purpose of this, in my mind, is to get familiar with who are national experts looking at a lot of these topics, and even if they're not giving a paper this week that is immediately newsworthy, take note of what they're saying, and if you're interested in these topics, look them up, introduce yourself, talk to them as possible sources in the future. I mean, with my group, I got lots of calls from journalists, logically at random times saying, I'm doing a story about this topic, do you know who I should talk to? And I do the best I can, but I don't know everyone. And it's always better, obviously, to have sources in advance that you know you can talk to. So in other words, a lot of what you're going to learn this week will be mostly useful in following up later on particular stories. Now, as for the actual conference, it seems sort of overwhelming. The way it is organized is about 7 time slots during the day. They hold about 15 or 20 panels simultaneously. So, suddenly you have hundreds of people giving papers, and there's no way you can cover them all. My suggestion is this, that before each day that you're going to be there, you can do this right now. I mean, even if you don't have the program, it's posted online. The website is asc41.com, and you don't even need to be registered. You have to navigate to find this year's conference, but the program is on there right now. I just looked at it yesterday, and what I would suggest that you do is the night before the day of the conference, scroll through. I mean, you can do it by day. They have it arranged, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. Scroll through the whole list and mark one or more in each time slot that you might be interested in, and just stop by and see. Again, there are always problems that you may be interested in only one of the 4 papers being given, and you might have to sit there and listen to the other ones, and there are always pitfalls in academia, like in journalism and anywhere else. A lot of these programs have to be submitted in March, like many months ago. So often I've had this experience. I see something that looks interesting, I go to the thing, the thing said this is going to be a report on a study of Chicago homicides. I'm making this up, and you get there, and the academic says, well, folks, I have bad news for you. I'm going to discuss the study I did, but I don't have the results yet, sorry. And there's going to be a lot of discussion, which there should be at this conference, of methodology. I don't know how many panels I've sat through of someone not giving the results of any study, but saying, here is how I did it in great detail, because that's what other academics are often interested in. So don't be surprised if, I guess I'm telling you, don't be surprised if there are many panels or presentations that are basically not newsworthy. So, and it's fine to leave these things, so that's in progress if you're polite about it. So I would suggest, again, to maximize what you can get out of this, as I said, marking down ones you're interested in, and have a plan B or a plan C, because if plan A doesn't work, it's good to have somewhere else to go rather than just sort of standing there saying, what am I going to do next? But that's my general suggestion. If you have any other questions, I'm glad to discuss it. By the way, I should say there are some panels you will see marked presidential panels, and these are generally more interesting. They're planned by the whole society on general topics. By the way, I'm doing one myself on Wednesday morning about the state of criminal justice reform in the state. I promise that won't be boring, because we're not going to go into methodology there.
All right. Okay, so thanks much. So we have plenty of time for questions.
All right, hello. Thank you all. First of all, my name is Philip Jackson of the HuffPost, based in Maryland, D.C. area. I wanted to ask both Annie and Libor if they could kind of answer this question. After the protest, and I think it could be relevant in the Laquan McDonald situation too as well. Obviously, there were protests throughout the country. I was at the Baltimore Center at the time, covering a lot of protests there as well, and D.C. was like a neighboring city too. But there was kind of like this talk about how our police, like local police departments in major cities, were kind of going to move forward with their attitudes, their practices, in the cities that they police ever so often. And there was this one situation, you know, where actually like a cop was at a protest in front of City Hall and kind of like arguing with a protester about like what happened with Freddie Gray, and that was like way back in 2015. But that was happening, you know, like a lot of these discussions with these killings that happened years ago, 5 or 6 years ago and whatnot, were kind of resurfacing after George Floyd was murdered and things like that. And I wanted to know, in like the case of Laquan McDonald and George Floyd, like, did you see any type of shift with police, with how they treated people, even just like their attitudes within the department, and how that might have impacted the city on a political aspect, race aspect, or anything of that sort?
No. I'm just playing. No, that's sort of the cynical response. No, not too much. We were actually talking about this earlier, about how in a lot of respects, a lot of these movements around reform have lost steam, right? There's rising anxieties around crime, and that's kind of, in some respects, it's kind of reverting back to the status quo. So I would say, if we're just talking about police, based on my conversations with folks, there were definitely a lot of officers inside the MPD, inside the Minneapolis Police Department, that were just mortified and horrified, just like everybody else, after having seen the video of George Floyd's murder, right? And they pointed to, you know, problems with this particular precinct, all these other issues within the force. I noticed it sort of swing after a few months, weeks of sustained protests, because eventually there was this like sense of, well, I'm a good cop, right? I'm trying to reform the system from the inside. Why is everyone else lumping me in with this same group, or with the other sort of like thumpers on the force? So, and I get the impression, you know, I haven't conducted like a survey or anything, scientific study, so this is just my take on it, is that that feeling has hardened over in recent months. So we had this election a few weeks ago now, where we were talking about, it's called Question 2, and it was supposed to remove language from the city charter, which is like the city's constitution, that required the city to have a police force, and it was supposed to open the door for this new public safety agency that was going to take a public health approach to public safety, rather. So you'd still have some cops, but you'd also have a contingent of mental health experts, violence interrupters, any number of other civilian teams that would respond to calls. And just like talking to cops about that, I don't think a lot of them like understood. They saw it as sort of like a referendum on policing itself, right? So if you voted for this this amendment, this charter amendment, you were voting against police. Like that was kind of the framing. So I would say that to me is sort of emblematic. Like that shows where their minds are at even a year and a half after George Floyd, and vast amounts of reporting and countless protests and you know, people being quite clear about what it is that they're trying to accomplish. There are still some people in the force that just equate voting for this like reform-minded amendment to getting rid of police overnight. So, no.
So to be sure, so you're asking, have we seen a change here in Chicago? Like, are police treating?
Right, yeah, like even back when, and I asked that because there was like this talk in Baltimore after Marilyn Mosby had charged the 3 cops involved in the death of Freddie Gray, and kind of how they were pursuing neighborhoods on a day-to-day basis years after that, you know, like, I mean, to be like kind of blunt, you know, like cops were mad about it. You know, they weren't used to kind of being held to that level of authority, especially by state prosecutors. So.
Right. So I would say I'm not aware of anything definitive that has come out and says we have proof that they're treating people better. What I will say I observe in Chicago is the conversation seems more open to them needing to change, which in and of itself right there to me is new and different. And again, we have a consent decree, like they are mandated to change. So I feel like there is more conversation around it, and the department is certainly acknowledging it more. But I mean, I don't think we could say we're, I asked one of my colleagues like to describe reform, and he was comparing it to the Titanic. You know, like you have a massive system and infrastructure that you're trying to turn in a different way. And so, I mean, I think we're, I guess none of the monitors reports anyway at this point have come across and said we know, you know, anything definite.
A second, but I just have a quick question for Libor. First of all, you made reference to thumpers. Give me the what are thumpers?
I mean, I'm guessing the term is probably more universal. I thought it was just unique to Minneapolis, but just police officers who in the past were just known for kind of their heavy-handed tactics, and they would wear like leather gloves with like lead embedded right here on the knuckles. So yeah, just cops with a lot of civilian complaints.
Okay, all right, just hadn't heard that term before. I was hoping you could also just talk for a minute about what kind of response and relationship you had with police officers, you know, ones that you talked with before George Floyd, and then then after the murder of George Floyd and all the protests. Did they all continue to talk with you? Did some of them, you know, kind of freeze up and not want to help the media or talk with the media more? Could you maybe just talk about kind of your sourcing and how it changed over those months?
I mean, it definitely changed. So I think I had like my rock solid sources, or people that had already developed certain relationship, like trusting relationship, where they would still pick up the phone, you know, months and weeks after George Floyd's death. But yeah, other folks kind of wavered, and they shut down in the face of just overwhelming like public and media scrutiny, right? They were getting requests from outlets across the world, and you know, everybody was kind of holding up their department as sort of the big bad. So there was a certain circling of the wagons and some defensiveness, and in particular, the police union, which had, you know, they'd always taken the approach of, you know, we're gonna go into like PR damage control and mitigate any problems from any controversy, get ahead of it by holding a press conference and giving like the cops' version or account of things. They completely shut down. Like they released a couple of news releases after George Floyd's death. A few of them were mostly like critical of the police administration and City Hall and other leaders. But aside from that, they kind of completely cut us off. And I will say I had the experience early on. When I first started on the beat, I was working, the PIO at the time was like, he was terrible. Like he just wouldn't return my phone calls. You know, he just always gave me the same kind of bullshit boilerplate response to some very like detailed questions for certain stories. But I think in a sense it made me a better reporter, because if he had spoon-fed me when I was, you know, first starting out on the beat, I would have been like beholden to him, or at least like far more reliant on him early on. So it forced me to develop sources elsewhere in the department, but also all these other professions and fields that intersect with public safety. So when they did kind of freeze us out after George Floyd, it wasn't as like damaging.
Hi, my name is Tiffany Cusack Smith. I'm a race and justice reporter for the USA Today Network of New York. I remember the George Floyd's killing, and one of the things that really comes to mind was the initial police statement that was put out and how sparse that was compared to, you know, what people actually, you know, observed and what was taped. And I've covered a number of misconduct cases, and it seems like that's kind of what seems to happen, you know, whether it's in Buffalo or it's another incident. So, you know, for you as like a reporter who kind of gets those initial press releases, you know, how do you, you know, get the news out there and also handle your initial like skepticisms that you may have about, you know, the incidents that might happen, and the language is very vague, might say like trooper involved, or, you know, without specifically saying what exactly happened.
I kind of wonder whether you went through the same thing after Laquan McDonald, or before it. Yeah, countless times. I will say, you know, if Darnella Frazier wasn't there, or if no one was there recording this or going live, this story would have been completely different. Like, I'd like to think that I'm this enterprising reporter who would have gotten to the bottom of this, but I don't know. I don't know if we would have poked as hard and as long if we didn't have the benefit of this video, like such a visceral video that, but yeah, I mean, you know, over time covering public safety, you know, you develop this healthy skepticism and in a lot of respects like cynicism around the official account, and you're confronted with this, you know, like you said, a vaguely worded police report or a news release, and I think maybe the good reporters will just report it as is, do a couple follow-up stories where they interview some activists who say, no, it wasn't this way. They interview the victim's family. The better reporters are really gonna, like, it's not gonna stop them, it's gonna embolden them and try to really get at the truth. So you start working your sources in the department that maybe have seen, you know, in this case there was obviously the body cam footage, but there was also like surveillance footage from any number of businesses in the area. And you scour social media and see if anybody witnessed this incident and tweeted about it or posted about it on Facebook. So yeah, it shouldn't stop you, but here's the flip side. We're working in like daily journalism. Like, if we had the benefit of sitting there and being able to like devote all of our brain power to this single case, I'm sure all of us would like produce like incredible enterprise reporting. But sometimes you got, you know, the next day there's a double homicide somewhere, and you got to jump on that. So it's always balancing that.
Yeah,
I agree. I think well, I can only speak for Chicago. They have a history of the same thing, the very vaguely worded, what did they say? It was a medical distress call, right? They have a history of doing that too. They've been called out on it since. There have been stories that have been written about that history specific. I'll be honest though, I read the press releases, and a lot of them come out daily. Like, are they churning out a lot? I mean, there's so many of them. Of course you read them, but yeah, I think it's incumbent upon all of us to check out everything they say, right? What is the City News? I worked at City News, and it was, if your mother says she loves you, check it out, was like the basic rule. So I feel like that's one lesson any criminal justice reporter in the past couple of years learned.
Oh, I actually had the same questions that were just asked, the two previous ones, but I'll just take it a step further. I wonder if there have been any newsroom-wide changes. I sometimes think like the management also has to have a reckoning of sorts, because sometimes reporters might feel the pressure of having to produce a story, or on the opposite end, push back and say, I don't think this is the full story. So I just wonder if your newsrooms have gone through any major changes about, we're not going to write up a press release unless we have more information, or whatever it may be. I'm just curious about that.
Yeah, we've had some conversations. This is a little bit different, but around mugshots and use of them is one thing that comes to mind. I don't know, have you guys have had any?
I don't want to come across as too sort of self-righteous, but I do look at some of my predecessors on this beat and their coverage around crime and even, on a broader scale, communities of color. And it's, I understand why there's a certain level of resentment or anger towards legacy news outlets in a lot of respects. So we've done some soul searching. I think it's mostly like the low-hanging fruit, like doing away with the, I call them like novelty crime briefs that they don't serve any sort of public interest. You're just writing about it because somebody has like an unusual name, or I wrote one, like I've done this myself, especially early on in my career. I wrote about a dude who was charged with stealing like some absurd amount of printer ink or toner, like 3 tons worth or something. I didn't have to write that story. Like, that was strictly off of how unusual the crime was. But so there have been some conversations around that. I wish we would go further. I look at what like the LA Times and the Kansas City Star did, like a real examination of their coverage and an apology and all sorts of columns and stories that were produced that came out of it. I look at what the Plain Dealer is doing and the Boston Globe, like these right to be forgotten projects where if someone like me wrote a story about you, and you were, the charges were dismissed or whatever, or even if you served your time, you could appeal to the paper to get those stories scrubbed from the website. Because as we find out more about like how people get entangled in the criminal justice system, I think we as newsrooms should sort of change, right? Because I don't want this like throwaway brief to hinder your ability to get a job or housing down the road. So
one other thing that and this is an issue in an industry with shrinking resources, right? But we have been talking a lot about how we cover every community and neighborhood in Chicago to make sure that your crime reporter is not the only person out there covering neighborhoods. And so we've done that kind of soul searching to make sure that we're covering kind of the full experience of every community in Chicago. Crime, I don't know about you or you guys are all criminal justice reporters. I feel like everybody wants the news right now, and that could be a Chicago thing because it is such a massive, big story. But there's such an appetite for it, and I think you're right. We have to be careful about what we pick and choose. and what we write about, and why is it newsworthy? And that gets back to kind of what I was saying, is what does this move the needle? Like, what does this tell us about the violence? What does this tell us about reform? Like, I try to ask myself those kinds of questions. On the other hand, I think too, like, the fact that somebody is always paying attention to how many people are getting shot in this city matters to me too, because that matters. But how do you present that and tell that story is so important. Because I mean, it's a lot of people. I mean, we can have summer weekends here with 70 people shot. And then the next weekend, 60 or 50 shot. So how you present that matters a lot. You got to get to why, to what does the public need to know about a city that's got that much violence happening without harming, anybody you're writing about.
Hi, my name's Akayla Lacey. I'm with The Intercept. Thank you all for being here. I wanted to ask, have you all had to deal with racial bias or stereotyping in your own newsrooms? And if so, how do you deal with that or talk about it?
I can start since I am holding a microphone. I know, right? It's tricky. It's a difficult question. The Marshall Project, we put out diversity reports each year telling the public how diverse our own staff is as a newsroom that covers criminal justice day in, day out. I think we could have more Black editors. We could have more Black reporters. We made a good faith effort trying to hire people who are formerly incarcerated. That's an asset in our newsroom, and that changed things a lot. One of the first things that I learned joined the Marshall Project 2 years ago out of school is we were working on a story about how much money prison system give out to prisoners upon release. It's not a lot. Sometimes it's not even enough to cover the basic transportation. I was working on a data piece of that, and I would use the word inmate a lot. Say prison pays inmate this much. And in the newsroom, I have a colleague who's formerly incarcerated, and I notice he physically cringes every time I say that word, because it has a huge implication on someone who had that experience. It's an insult to call someone who's incarcerated inmate. It's also not accurate. If someone is in prison, call them a prisoner. If someone is in jail, they're not convicted in a lot of times, right? They're waiting for trial. They couldn't pay a bond, or they're serving time for a misdemeanor or something very minor. So language matters, and for me, it was the hard lesson. I'm really grateful that I'm in a newsroom with that kind of diversity, and I'm in a newsroom where people feel passionate about the mission, and people feel it's their responsibility to speak up if they don't see something, if they see something that's cringeworthy. So I got called out on that, and we recently published a series of essays on the use of word of inmate. In our newsroom, we have moved away from using that word in all of our coverage, and when we partner with other local or national organizations, we insist that word not to be used because it's insulting and it's also not journalistically accurate.
I was just going to add quickly, sometimes it sort of manifests itself in subtle ways, like getting pushback from editors about using a source of color on a story. And again, it just kind of happens subtly or around the framing of a certain story. I'm sure you all have to navigate newsroom politics in some shape or form. In Minnesota, like, people are very, Allison can attest to this, very passive aggressive, right, and non-confrontational, so that adds an added layer of complexity. Like, you can't come at a person too directly or they're gonna like get defensive. And so, but yeah, you just gotta, push back, but sometimes, again, getting back to daily journalism, you're on deadline, and you just gotta pick your battles in a lot of respects.
Yeah, well, clearly the media generally have done an enormous amount of coverage of the racial aspects of criminal justice. It's hard to know where to trace this. A lot of people trace it to the Michael Brown Ferguson, Missouri case in 2014 and all the cases that have followed. So I think most of us would say this is justified. I mean, people say to me, I'm sure you've all had the same reaction to this Arbery case in Georgia. You know, how could this all have happened? But and I am sure there have been cases like that, probably many of them that went unreported in previous years. So I think it's probably good that the media are more sensitive to this.
Hi, I'm Emily Wilder with the Press Democrat in the San Francisco Bay Area. I wanted to follow up on what David had asked about basically ethical coverage. For those of us, particularly us rookie reporters who are kind of expected to do those daily quick hit crime pieces, sort of as a rite of passage or something, what are your best practices for deepening that coverage, making it more ethical? I appreciate the note about like human first, humanizing language, but other tips and tricks when you have to churn out 3 a day. How can you make those better?
Diversify your sources, and not just like ethnically, but I started thinking about this beat more holistically, and again, like considering all these other areas that intersect with policing and crime, so housing, access to healthcare, all these sort of underlying social forces. So seeking out experts in those fields to help provide some context for some of these stories. It's not always possible, for some of these like 8-inch, 12-inch crime briefs necessarily, but if you are turning a daily, don't just always go talk to the usual suspects. Now, even after a conversation with a friend of mine, even like started being a bit wary of reaching out to criminologists. All due respect to your colleagues, right? But because a lot of them have law enforcement backgrounds, and a lot of them served as cops or sheriff's deputies or whatever. So, not to diminish their perspective or take anything away from that, but just recognizing that they come at it from a certain perspective. And while they do study crime, they approach it or they view it through a certain lens. So my best advice would just be try to reach out to different type of experts. So.
Yeah, I would say that when I first started covering shootings or homicides in Chicago, I tried to always have a community source that I could call. So my goal was to find somebody on the police department who could tell me for real what they think happened, not just the press release, but then what was, in my Rolodex back then, what was like the neighborhood group I could call to say, hey, do you know about that shooting in the 5700 block of, South Ada, and what was it about, or what's going on that block? Is it shocking? And try to get their voice into it. And that was how I also started talking to, back then, the outreach teams that were in Chicago. Their outreach is still in Chicago. This was a different organization, but I was like, well, if the police are going to tell me their theory of what happened, maybe the people who are working with the former gang members might have a theory about what happened. So I would just try to gather the bits and pieces from all of them as a way to, I think, diversify, like you said, if time allows. But wow, 3 stories a day, that sounds pretty intense.
Hi, I'm Maria. I'm with the Las Vegas Review-Journal. My question might be a little redundant, but, and this is for Libor. After covering this national story that had such a huge impact nationwide and even in other countries, I guess, what is your biggest takeaway? Like, has anything changed in kind of your day-to-day reporting that you do differently now with kind of the way you were informed with this reporting on George Floyd?
This is going to be a disappointing response, but I've been so like immersed in this story for so long that I don't know if I've had the chance to like take a step back and necessarily consider everything that's happened. So I don't know if I have a good response for you. I just, because it just keeps going. I mean, you talk about consent decrees, we're probably staring down one of those. We have upcoming federal trial of all 4 officers, state trial of the remaining 3 officers. You know, Derek Chauvin is likely to appeal. Like there's constant updates. And then from the community side of things and all these conversations around policing, I think maybe in general, there's been a re-examination of the crime beat or police beat, some of the things I talked about with like maybe getting rid of certain stories, coming to grips with the harm that news organizations have caused over the years through their coverage, being less reliant on police sources. I mean, that's kind of a big thing where
I just had one thought. I know it was a question for you, but for me, I feel like, and this gets back to your team being called public safety, right? I feel a more clearer vision about the questions we should be asking, which is, what makes the community safe? And that will take you off of the police department as your only answer. And if you start asking that, it's going to lead you to all different kinds of people and thoughts and ideas. And it doesn't mean you're not a crime I mean, it's public safety, right? So try to answer that. At least that's what I'm doing these days, more so. And sadly, I mean, I think that has become more clear to me in the past 2 to 3 years as we've been dealing with this.
I mean, that's it. And then also trying to anticipate what comes next. I don't think anyone, or at least I couldn't like anticipate something like what happened with George Floyd and the ensuing unrest and like this national reckoning. I don't think I could anticipate that, but there are certain things about once you do start to think about public safety more holistically, trying to anticipate, okay, where is this heading? What questions should I be asking? What are my like story targets? Just to get ahead of it, because one of my big regrets is not having written that 3rd precinct story 4 or 5 years ago. And you know, maybe that's a failure on my part in not having been out in the community enough to have picked up on it, but it shouldn't take like a seismic event like this for me to write a story about some troubling policing. So.
And going back to what I said earlier, for years, a lot of us did a bad thing, namely at the end of every year, the whole story about crime would be, what did the police chief say? The police chief gives out some figures, and he or she talks about it, and that is 100% of the story. And that's obviously, in my opinion, bad journalism. I didn't realize it at the time. I mean, I don't think anyone here mentioned public health. People are very into criminal justice now, or into crime and what causes it or what is to be done about it. So that's just another category of people that we should be talking to.
I'm going to give the last question to myself. Weiwa, I mean, she had a lot of good resources, different data sets. I was hoping you could just tell me about the NIBRS. What is that? What you can learn from it? What can you learn from it? And how easy is it for a data novice to use?
Well, I personally haven't had much chance to use it. I'll turn it over to my fellow panelists. It's been a very slow developing thing. I mean, what it is, I'm going to oversimplify here, but in the past, we've just had these very raw crime statistics that there were 29 robberies last year, and that's the entire thing we know. Now, NIBRS is designed, I think, to have 54, something like that, data points for every crime. Of course, you're not going to get 54 for every one, but this is now a federal requirement, but I am told that a lot of cities and jurisdictions are unable to comply with it. But the idea is to really provide lots of different data points on every single crime. So we just don't know there was one robbery or there was one robbery on Michigan Avenue. We know a lot more about it, but I don't, this is being implemented slowly by the states. I think well, maybe half of them are even trying to compile this. Have any of you have any experience with this?
I think Ted basically covers it. So I think the most recent NIBRS data set is going to come out in about a month, end of November/December. So the instant-based report is different from what FBI used to collect through the UCR program, because precisely like what Ted said, instead of the police department saying this month X number of homicide took place or X number of rape took place, it's going to break down by what's the demographic for the victims, what's the demographic for the offender, what are the circumstances if we know it. If there is a robbery, how much damage, what's the dollar amount, can we put that on the damage? It's very exciting for a nerd like me because that will allow us to dig into so many different circumstances. For example, how many rapes are actually being cleared? What type of rape cases are most likely to be cleared by police departments? Are they cleared by arrests, or are they cleared by what police departments call exceptional circumstances, which basically means in a lot of cases the victim refused to collaborate with us, so we'll just close the case. There are a gazillion questions on my mind that I'm hoping to answer with the data, but unfortunately, like with the other program, it's voluntary, and criminologists are very suspicious about how many police departments will actually participate. It's very likely that by next year this time, we wouldn't even have enough data to be able to say how many homicides took place nationwide. It's likely that maybe the whole state of Mississippi will not report through this program and will lose a lot of insight because FBI is officially terminating the UCR, the summary report program, and shifting to instant report.